I'm John Bandley, Editor of International Employment Lawyer. We have an important discussion ahead of us, but before we get started, there are a few housekeeping points to cover. First and foremost, please use the online question tool to post any questions you might have for the panelists. Second, if you have any audio-visual problems during the presentation, please do let us know also with the online question tool, and a member of our team will be on hand to help you. And finally, just to note that today's session is being recorded and will be shared via email and on our website in the coming days. All that being said, it's now my pleasure to welcome today's panelists. Krista Larson serves as Morgan Lewis's Director of Employee Wellbeing. In this global position, she works to design and implement a custom wellbeing curriculum as part of the firm's employee engagement efforts. Krista earned her master's in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania, where she studied the science of wellbeing with the founder of the field, Dr. Martin Seligman. It was through this experience that she became passionate about the use of positive psychology to enable organisations and their people to better thrive. Next, we have Elizabeth Melville of Old Square Chambers in London. Called to the bar in 1994, Elizabeth has over 20 years' experience as an employment lawyer and also specialises in high-level investigatory and internal disciplinary work. Elizabeth complements her core legal practice with expertise in mental health and wellbeing, in which she takes a keen interest and lectures regularly. She has studied analytical psychology with a London-based training organisation, including undertaking a clinical placement with an NHS psychiatric clinic, and has worked one-to-one with clients therapeutically. Elizabeth is a qualified mediator and is able to conduct workplace mediations, coaching, and internal training. She also regularly chairs appeals and grievance hearings within organisations. And last but not least, we have Chris Parsons, mental health champion and chair of the India practice at Herbert Smith Freehills. Chris has been with Herbert Smith for 36 years, and having suffered from serious mental health issues himself, he's very aware of the stigma that surrounds the topic. His aim is to reduce the stigma so that mental ill health is treated exactly the same as physical ill health. He does this by telling his own personal story within HSF to its clients and to other organisations. Towards the end of 2018, Chris completed an intensive programme in psychotherapy at Regent University in London. He's also a trustee of MQ Mental Health, the leading mental health research charity in the UK. Its vision is to build a world where mental illness is understood, effectively treated, and ultimately prevented. A warm welcome to you all. The long-term effects of COVID-19 on employees are numerous. So it is important for both law firms and their clients to understand the likely impact the pandemic will have on employee mental health and well-being. Today's speakers will be offering some best practice advice on how to prepare and protect your workforce. And although some of this will be from a UK perspective, there will undoubtedly be takeaways that can be applied to any jurisdiction. Elizabeth, to set the scene, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What are the most common forms of mental ill health or poor well-being that you've seen in employment disputes, and what change, if any, have you noticed during the pandemic?
Okay, so to put that in context, I spent about 20 years doing fairly standard employment litigation. And in the last 5 years or so, I've been doing mostly internal investigatory work, both where people have raised grievances about serious allegations and also reviews of culture within organisations. And in both of those contexts, I think pre-COVID, the mental ill health and poor well-being that I saw fell into two broad categories. The first was what you would expect, really. So depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, tearfulness. I often interview people who've suffered from bullying and harassment there. You can see the effects that it has. So tearfulness, low mood, that's one category. The second category might be more surprising. The type of psychology I studied, I know Krista studied positive psychology, was the psychology of Carl Jung, and he had this phrase latent psychosis, and it's something that I think you see as an employment lawyer more often than you might expect, and I would characterize it as behaviour which doesn't necessarily merit a diagnosis of schizophrenia or some serious mental health condition like that, but where the person is exhibiting paranoia, strange ideas, obsessiveness, and that does tend to manifest at the sharp end of the employment law practice. That does tend to manifest, and it's very difficult, I think, for employers to manage because it doesn't tend to get diagnosed, particularly not by GPs. During and post, if we are post-COVID, I don't think we are yet, but I think there's obviously been an uptick in anxiety. I spoke to a few colleagues prior to this talk. One of them had been discussing the effects of COVID with a consultant psychiatrist, and she had said that COVID had rocked the psychological boat of the workforce, and I thought that was a really apt description. And I've certainly seen it in the work I've been doing. One example is anxiety about COVID security for employees who either have to work in the workplace or who are now returning to the workplace. And in that context, I think it's really important that employers appreciate that not only do people have different circumstances, they may have underlying health conditions or live with people who do, they also have different risk appetites, and that depends to some extent on people's different typologies. And those risk appetites need to be managed sensitively if employers are to keep employee anxiety within sort of reasonable bounds and make sure that it doesn't tip over into something more serious.
Some ill health and poor well-being stems from outside the workplace rather than inside. Think about bereavement or substance abuse, for example. Should employers draw a distinction between where the poor mental health or well-being is coming from? Can they ignore any issues that originate outside of their organisation?
So with a couple of caveats, the answer to that question is no, they can't ignore poor mental health or well-being if it originates from outside of the workplace. One of the key pieces of legislation I'm sure some of the viewers will be familiar with that employers have to comply with is the Equality Act and the disability provisions of the Equality Act. And mental health impairment, no matter where it comes from or what caused it, can classify as a disability under the Equality Act. And although we might, in our sort of everyday folk understanding of disability, have a conception of it as being something very serious, that's not how the Equality Act defines it. It's quite a low threshold, and I always advise employers to assume that a condition may constitute a disability and act accordingly. And as I say, any condition, no matter what its origin, can constitute a disability, and employers have duties to act towards those employees in a certain way, the most important of which is the duty to make reasonable adjustments to the employee's work or workplace. The caveats I mentioned, you talked about substance abuse. Addictions don't fall within and can't fall within the category of disability under the Equality Act, although conditions that flow from addiction can do. So if somebody drinks but then becomes depressed as a result of that, as opposed to the other way round, that depression may well constitute disability. The other caveat is where the impairment, the mental health condition, is caused or exacerbated by something that's happened in the workplace. The authorities suggest that the employer has to, the phrase is, go the extra mile. So if, for example, somebody is off sick with a mental health condition and the employer is starting to think they've been off for too long, we can't continue with this, we might dismiss them on capability grounds. If that condition was caused or exacerbated by something that went wrong in the workplace, for which the employer might be liable, then they would be well advised to go the extra mile, to make extra efforts to ensure that there's no alternative to whatever it is they're proposing to do.
And what about the issue of privacy? Because some employers may feel wary about asking someone how they're doing at work. Yeah.
John, I wonder, Elizabeth, forgive me, I wonder if I could just jump in on the topic you touched on, which is substance abuse, addiction, etc., because it's a subject very close to my heart and one I feel very strongly about. And actually, I'm going to speak now openly, not by reference to the law. So part of my story is that as a result of high levels of anxiety and my depression, that I self-medicated for many years and actually became an alcoholic. I am an alcoholic, albeit in recovery and currently in a good place. And part of the chat and the reality is there are a lot of people who will be suffering from addiction, albeit they are functioning addicts, and whatever that addiction might be. And of course, there's a very broad spectrum. It could be alcohol, drugs, excessive work, pornography, relationships, gaming, a whole bunch of stuff. And in my experience, almost everybody who suffers from some kind of addiction, there will be an underlying mental health issue. And so, you know, part of my mission in telling my story is to try and reduce the stigma around addiction in the way that the stigma has been reduced increasingly around depression and the more common forms of mental ill health. But addiction still attracts a very, very high level of stigma, which means that people are often very reluctant to talk about it. Because of my story, many people do talk to me about their addictions, but in private rather than publicly. So I thought I'd just share that for the purposes of this debate.
Yeah, no, thank you for the contribution.
Thank you, Chris. And I couldn't agree more. And actually, what I was going to say, but, you know, sort of conscious of time, that even though under the black letter law, addictions don't qualify or potentially qualify for disabilities and the you know, the sort of ensuing obligations on employers, I think employers, you know, frankly should, if they can, treat them in exactly the same way that they would treat any other mental health condition, because they don't just arise in a vacuum. Sorry, the question you asked was about privacy. So just to go back to that, I think it's right, employers are, you know, right to be careful about privacy, particularly now we have GDPR and have had for some years, and information about employees' health is sensitive personal information and needs to be dealt with accordingly. Having said that, employers can't afford to be too wary of talking about these things, and it's in fact important to talk about them, not just for personal reasons, but for legal reasons. The Equality Act says that employers have obligations in relation to disability that they know or ought to have known about. And the example that's given in the guidance is of a woman whose depression causes her to cry at work. And what it suggests is that in that situation, and of course we can think of all kinds of ramifications, you know, somebody, their appearance changes, their performance drops off a cliff, they're not turning up to meetings, whether those are virtual or in person, they behave in some sense differently, that the employer has to make a proactive attempt to find out if there's something underlying that. And if they don't make that proactive attempt, then they may be liable in the sense that they ought to have known that there was a condition. The signs were there, but they ignored them. Those kind of discussions obviously need to be treated sensitively, so privately, either remotely or in a private room in the office. You need to obtain an employee's consent to share that information with key individuals, whether that's their line manager, their colleagues, whoever else. And they might want to manage how that information is disseminated. But if you don't ask, you might be found liable. And those kind of conversations, I would just add, are even more important with people working from home, because it's so difficult to know how people are if you don't actively ask them.
What would you say are the worst case scenarios for an organisation that doesn't take wellbeing concerns seriously, legal or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I think otherwise, maybe Chris and Krista are a better place to answer those. I mean, obviously reputational in terms of the talent pool, particularly I find younger people who I interview a lot now are so much more aware of these things, and they're not going to go to employers that don't take these things seriously, or who handle cases badly. But the worst case scenarios legally are your employee is going to sue you, and there are a number of possibilities. One is that they will resign and claim that the way you handled their mental health or well-being was essentially in breach of contract, so in breach of their health and safety obligations, in breach of the implied duty of trust and confidence, which is implied into every UK employment contract. and they would bring a claim in the employment tribunal. The maximum compensation for that is just under 90,000 or a gross annual salary. The second is potentially a claim for disability discrimination, as we've been discussing. And again, that can be brought in the employment tribunal. The damages for that are potentially unlimited. So if you really, if things really go wrong and the losses are career limiting, then potentially the award can be very high. And the other thing to point out is that in terms of employment tribunal claims, employers very rarely get their costs back. It's a no-cost jurisdiction. There are only very limited circumstances in which employers can get their costs back, even if they win the claim. And then the other alternative, which is still slightly rarer, is that the employee claims, these are called sort of stress at work claims. They claim that they've suffered a personal injury as a result of the action or inaction of their employer. And they would bring those sorts of cases in the ordinary civil courts, the county court or the high court, where the normal costs rules apply. But again, the damages for that are potentially unlimited. So, you know, there are legal risks and there are reputational risks. And I'm sure Krista and Chris will be able to add more to that.
Yes, certainly on the reputational side, we've seen in the press recently lots of instances of certainly financial institutions who have got some bad press about how they're treating junior staff and their reactions to it. Chris, how employers respond to a worker's ill health is clearly important for both parties. You already mentioned your experiences at Herbert Smith a little bit, but could you tell a little more detail about what happened and crucially how Herbert Smith reacted to what you were telling them?
Yeah, no, of course. So look, you mentioned at the beginning, John, that I sit on the board of MQ Mental Health Research, which is the leading mental health research charity in the UK. And through that, you know, I've been able to learn a lot of stuff, which has been fantastic. And the reality is that the level of research that's been undertaken so far into mental ill health is incredibly limited, and that seems to me all the more surprising, given that mental ill health is the biggest cause of disability globally in the workplace today, and depression on its own is expected, I think, by 2040 to be the single biggest most cause of disability at work, absence from work. So we know less about it than we would like to know, and thankfully MQ and other organisations are doing some stuff about that. But one of the things I did learn was that the seeds of mental ill health are often sown during childhood up until the age of 18. Often it's up to 75% of people who go on to struggle with mental ill health issues do so as a result of those seeds in childhood. And that's certainly true of my story. I had a very difficult relationship with my dad. He in turn had a very difficult relationship with his dad, and I think he learnt some pretty bad habits, and his role model wasn't ideal, and he didn't warm to the process of fatherhood in a very good way. And look, I'm almost ashamed to say it, but he was so tough with me, and so he shouted at me pretty much every day that the one thing that kept me going was that I used to have an ongoing daydream that when I was big enough and strong enough that I would beat him to death. And so I took my worldview with me to school, to university, and to work. A worldview that was, you know, the world was an uncertain, difficult place, that individuals within it were unreliable and not to be trusted, and that they were dangerous. And so you might wonder why I ended up doing law, and sometimes I've asked myself that question, you know, going into a stressful environment. But I managed to keep the lid on things until I made equity partner in '96, and then I collapsed actually, and was rushed to hospital and had every conceivable test undertaken. And at the end of all of those tests, the consultant came to see me with a rather too large a smile on his face and said, "Mr. Parsons, we've done all the checks and there's nothing wrong with you. And of course, that was the worst news. I wanted something exotic and rare that would explain everything, both to me and to others. And the fact there was nothing physically wrong with me, of course, left only a mental health issue. And so my anxiety and stress very quickly turned into a deep depression. I thought I would never be able to support my family again. I didn't think I'd be able to go to work. I wouldn't be able to work colleagues in the eye. You know, it felt like the whole of my world was sort of crumbling. And thankfully, you know, I had then, you know, I was able through my brokenness to get some help and support through a psychiatrist and counselling. Medication saved my life. I'm absolutely sure of that, and continues to do so. I'm a very, very big fan of medication. Works for some people, not all people, and thankfully it works for me. But when I went back to the office, nobody in the mid-1990s talked about this stuff, and I think all that was said was that Chris had been working too hard, which was certainly true, and that he needed to recharge his batteries, and that was a narrative that I was happy to go along with. But of course, it was far more than that. And it was only really actually 6 years ago that I came out completely, if you like, when the Lord Mayor of London encouraged various organisations in the city to encourage their employees to record a "This Is Me" video. And I recorded one of the first ones of those and told my story. And it was really, you know, that was the start of people speaking openly about mental health, and what I would say is the firm has been absolutely fantastic, particularly in London. I'm not going to say that we get it all right, and I'm not going to say we get it all right in all jurisdictions. We've got a lot of work to do on that, not least given the cultural differences, but so much better than it was. And you know, I regard myself as extremely lucky that I'm still here, and I almost have to pinch myself that I've been at the firm for 36 years, given some of the challenges that I've been through.
Definitely. What advice would you give to those who may currently be suffering in silence as you were? Both to those who are suffering, but also to those in management positions who perhaps don't know how to react to someone coming to them saying, I've got depression, I've got anxiety, or anything else?
I guess from the individual's point of view, the first bit of advice, and the advice which, you know, it would have been nice if I could have given myself and followed it, would have been, you know, get help as quickly as possible. In the UK, you know, the typical route would be to go and see your GP and discuss your position with your GP. The GP would then make a referral to a psychiatrist who would have an oversight of your care and would decide whether or not you needed medication. And as part of that, you would likely receive then some counselling. So that's a very typical approach to mental health issues. You'd have perhaps some medication along with some counselling, and that's what I had, and what helped considerably. Inevitably through counselling, I talked about the relationship with my dad and my mum, and a whole bunch of stuff that helped and sort of started to make sense of my worldview. Definitely get help. Whether or not that individual should share exactly how they are with their employee, I'm a little bit practical and on this topic, in that if you are within an organization that is open and understanding, and increasingly there are organizations like that, then I think you should share openly. Where you're within an organization who still don't get this stuff, where it might impact your career, etc., I think I would be much more careful in what I shared, and I would simply say I'm unwell and need some time off and need to get some help. And GPs are very experienced at you know, writing a note to say, look, you know, this person is suffering from whatever, but without going into too much detail about exactly what it is. So I think it does depend on the nature of your organization as to how open you are about it. But I hope increasingly organisations will be happy is the wrong word, but would prefer to hear exactly what's going on so they can make the best use of that. The related question, I guess, you ask about what do you do if you're worried about a team member? And I think, again, it slightly depends on your own experience of this stuff. There are some people who are good at dealing with people who've got mental health issues. And inevitably, given my role within the firm, people will often come and talk to me. And so I will either actually take them for a coffee or have a virtual coffee with them, and I'll and something often comes out then. The phrase I will often use with somebody is that I'll say, I'm worried about you, and that will often result in a whole, the whole story coming out about the position they're in, and COVID certainly has resulted in that. And given my role in India, we've got lots of lawyers who did their undergraduate degrees in India and families back in India, and a number of those have lost family members. So I found myself speaking to a lot of them at the moment who are extremely worried about the position at home. I think if you're much less experienced, then you should turn to your HR department and get guidance and advice from them as to how best to approach the position. And it may be better that somebody from HR who's better at this stuff has those conversations, or many organizations now have what we call mental health sort of first aiders or ambassadors. And it may be that the individual is happy to speak to one of those rather than necessarily to their manager or the partner that they report to.
So, in your role as mental health champion at Herbert Smith, for those who don't have a similar role in their organisation, what do you specifically do, maybe on a day-to-day basis, that can maybe give them a sense of how they can implement something similar in their own organisations?
Yeah, well, look, rather than focusing on our firm, I can talk about what some other organisations have done as well. Look, Alan Overy, I know, have appointed a partner with overall responsibility for mental health, really as a demonstration of how seriously they take it. And then in each of their separate offices, they've appointed either a partner or a senior member of business services as somebody responsible for mental health, with a view to each of those offices building their own approach to mental ill health in that jurisdiction, reflecting the cultural issues that are relevant in those jurisdictions. And I'm very mindful, because I've given talks now in the UK, in India, in Australia, in Japan, in Singapore, in the Middle East, etc. I'm very conscious of different levels of acceptability around these discussions, and the stigma is less or more depending on which jurisdiction you're in. We formed some people groups where ideas come from those groups and are fed through to the people responsibility for mental ill health. And otherwise, I really spend as much time as I can, given my own struggles. I've had 5 pretty serious depressive episodes which have required time off work. And through that knowledge and experience, I am keen, whenever I can, to speak within the organization and to speak to people as groups or as individuals or as offices or as groups of offices around things both that the organization can do better, and also around personal tips and advice about how we can look after ourselves better. And it's something that I've sort of had to learn in order to sort of cope day to day.
And when you're talking to clients of the firm, how receptive are they to, I'm talking about the in-house counsel, your clients, how receptive are they to employee wellbeing in their organisation, but also amongst their external counsel? Are they thinking about, the lawyers they instruct as having mental health and wellbeing problems that they should also be careful of and not exacerbate it?
Yeah, look, I've seen just recently some incredibly positive developments, which I'll mention, because the dilemma is this. I'll give a talk, and then the response, understandably, from people within HSF or other organizations will say, well, look, that's all well and good, Chris, and this is how we can look after ourselves, and this is how we manage our hours and all the rest of it. But what happens if we've got a client who's saying to us, you know, we need it by this deadline, and I don't care how you get it to us, but this is when we need it. And that happens, you know, day after day or week after week, whatever the position is. And but the development that I've seen is this, and that's where, and it's a little bit like the development around gender equality or diversity or those sorts of things, where clients are starting to say to their outside legal advisors that we care about the quality of the advice that you give us. We care about the cost of that advice, etc. A whole load of parameters. But we also care about how you, HSF, look after your team. And I've had specific discussions with the global GC of Bupa and the global GC of ASOS, where they're saying that this is now starting to matter to us, and we want to have a meeting right at the start of a transaction to say, look, how are we together going to deliver this outcome for our business unit, and in a way that takes account of the mental well-being of my team, the in-house team, and the team that's looking after us. And that's a wonderful development, and I hope we will see more of that.
I'm sure Elizabeth will be, you know, hopefully that will also filter down to the independent bar as well. It sometimes feels that, when I've spoken by, it seems like the stress levels get passed from the in-house counsel to the instructing solicitor and then down to the bar, and the bar has to pick up the can sometimes with everything.
I think that is the case. I think we're maybe sort of, as a profession, you know, behind the curve for that reason. I have to say though, I've had, you know, very positive experience. The last piece of work that I did, which was within lockdown, with an in-house counsel and in-house solicitor, and all three of us had, you know, some quite open discussions about the challenges we were facing, homeschooling. You know, one of them had a spouse who was unwell, and it was really refreshing. It makes such a difference. But what Chris says about having that meeting at the beginning about how we're going to do this, not just to get the best outcome and costs and so forth, but how we're going to safeguard everybody's well-being, I think that is fantastic, and I really hope to see that, you know, that sort of practice become commonplace.
It's great to hear, because, you know, that there are many companies, you know, I've seen press releases on it that come my way, and they talk a great game about caring for employee well-being, but often when you drill down to the policies, there isn't necessarily much substance there. There maybe isn't a focal point or a person in the organisation to run with it and be someone that employees can go to, or what protection there is usually it's reactive, it's not proactive. So it doesn't necessarily get to the root cause of the problems that maybe that organisation is facing if there's a systemic issue there. Chris, I want to bring you in at last. Sorry, I kept you waiting so long, but what have you found works at Morgan Lewis, and what advice would you give to other firms or in-house teams that have yet to make mental health and well-being a priority?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think there are several factors that have been key to our success with this program over the years. A couple that I'll highlight for you. The first, and really I think the most foundational, is our holistic approach to well-being, right? So the idea that having well-being isn't as simple as being well versus unwell, right? Just because you maybe went to the doctor and got a clean bill of health, that doesn't necessarily mean you're thriving or able to be resilient. So keeping in mind that well-being is a continuum, it's a spectrum, and we're all on this continuous journey of striving for that more positive state of being. And a part of that is the recognition that well-being is multidimensional, right? So we can't point to one thing and say, that's what it looks like to be well. It's an variety of different aspects of our lives that we can be targeting and bolstering in order to truly thrive. So we at Morgan Lewis have a 5-dimension framework for well-being that for us encapsulates this holistic approach to the concept. Those dimensions are physical, emotional, community, intellectual, and occupational well-being. And so our programming and our efforts target each one of those different 5 factors in order to really just bring the whole person into the consideration. Another key to success for us has been our leadership support of our well-being programming. And I'm talking about like really authentic, like Chris Parsons level of support and sponsorship and recognition of the importance of well-being strategy for our organization. So at the very top, our firm chair, Jamie McKeon, has long been a leader in lawyer well-being. She speaks regularly to the importance of things like employee engagement and mental health in a successful law firm culture. Our managing partner of practice, Steve Wall, is another great example. He too has had some personal experiences with alcoholism and recovery and has been very open and candid and vulnerable in speaking about his experience, so that even from the very top, these are topics that we're discussing and recognizing and helping combat the stigma. So just a couple of examples of ways that, I think our leadership has been really authentically supportive of helping find ways to enable our Morgan Lewis personnel to have the tools and strategies to create lives in which they thrive, both personally and professionally.
And no doubt, much like with Herbert Smith, the pandemic has made being able to check up on people much more difficult. So how have you adapted your wellbeing policies to take that into account? And looking forward, how is firm preparing for an era where COVID's gone, but maybe not all the lawyers want to go back to the office? How does that work out?
Yeah, for us, the way that we worked pre-pandemic was very office-based, like I'm sure is the case for a lot of the people listening to this webinar. And for us, that meant we just had a lot of kind of natural, organic opportunities in how we went about our days to have connections with our colleagues, both formally and informally. We were just connecting in person and having high-quality connections just as we were going about our work. And one of the things that I've always loved the most about working at Morgan Lewis is we have a really strong culture of community. And so a goal of ours in the remote work environment was to extend that sense of community to the way that we were working virtually. And so I think we've done that in several ways that have been quite successful. One example that I'll share with all of you are our wellness-focused team building classes that we have been hosting for our various practice groups. So in these classes, our attorneys and oftentimes, frankly, their family, their roommates, whomever is at home with them will come together on this virtual platform for these classes where we have professional instructors leading the group through a class on just like a wide variety of well-being topics, everything from office ergonomics to karaoke and yoga and kickboxing classes, healthy cooking demonstrations. So bringing the group together, creating those connection opportunities, but in a way that's really focused on their holistic well-being and providing them with tools and strategies to support themselves and each other during these challenging times. So just an example of some of the ways that we're really thinking actively about how are we creating those connection opportunities in the remote environment, because we just need to be more intentional about it than how we used to have to be in the offices when we were in person. And it was just more natural to kind of come about people in that way. And then in terms of your second question, John, about kind of how do we think about transitioning back to the workplace? I think it's going to be really critical for everybody, but especially leaders, to just keep in mind that this is a transition that's going to require some, time and support and grace as we get settled back into our new routines, quite similar to the transition and all that it took for us to get settled into the remote work environment back in 2020, right? It's a transition in the same sense. A part of that, I think, especially for leaders, will be to remember that even though we're going to be coming back to the same physical space together when we return to the office, we're all going to be coming back as different people who have gone through a traumatic experience to some extent in the past year, right? And the word traumatic might sound hyperbolic, but I really don't think it is in the case of the pandemic and the just confluence of crises that we've all had to grapple with. We've all lost something, whether it's been, you know, a loved one to the virus, or an important life milestone, or even just, you know, progress towards a long-term goal. We've all been deeply affected by recent events. And I think that to the extent we can keep that human element intact during this transition and just lead with support and emotional intelligence and understanding, that's just going to be really key to helping people transition back to the workplace successfully and authentically.
Leadership seems to be the key word here. It's having people in a position like yourself, like Chris, like Elizabeth, and who are willing to talk about these sorts of things and, you know, make them business critical. So, and as Chris actually touched on earlier, when it comes to the always on culture in law firms, you know, it's difficult to see how that is going to change, even if we are slightly more aware of mental health and wellbeing issues. I mean, there was some recent statistics from the Association of Corporate Counsel, which found that 75% of respondents were experiencing moderate to exceedingly high levels of burnout. Half were experiencing sleep problems and chronic fatigue. A quarter were experiencing increases in substance abuse, whether it's alcohol or tobacco. Half indicated they were able to switch. They were only able to switch off completely from work-related matters, while, you know, the other half, you know, found that they couldn't do that. So, you know, from your perspective, you know, is there a way that you know, Morgan Lewis is finding a way to get their team to disconnect a little bit from work and you know, have that time away?
Yeah, a few things come to mind when I hear the term always on. One of them being actually our firm chair, Jamie McKeon, recently said something that I think does well to speak to this factor, which was, she said something to the extent of, you know, we're not going to be able to fully take away the stress and demand of having a legal practice, right? That's the nature of professional services to some extent. There are things we can do to ease those demands and lessen that stress, but we're never going to be able to take it totally away. But what we can do is provide people with the tools and strategies and resources based in the science of fields like positive psychology that can help them overcome that adversity, be resilient, and create lives where they are thriving, both personally and professionally. So I think that truth of sort of that, you know, give and take is important to bring into that consideration. And then another part of it too is, you know, I think even in the past several years, work and life have become increasingly integrated, and that was only exacerbated by the pandemic, right? So I think that to the extent organizations can help people understand how to make those boundaries of work and life, take that time to really disconnect and turn off from work and recharge, is going to be really important in this current remote work environment, and I think as well moving forward into post-pandemic life. And that's going to look different for everybody, what that looks like. But I think that just speaks to how well-being programs in organizations really need to offer a variety of tools and strategies and recommendations for folks to consider and then adopt what's going to work best for them as unique individuals.
Before we move on to questions from those who are watching, you know, are there any sort of last top tips you might give for designing a wellbeing program in a firm or an in-house team?
You know, I think I would just underscore kind of what I just mentioned, in that variety and flexibility are key, right? And this was really emphasized for me during the pandemic, because what we were hearing from people is what was their top stressor and the biggest adversity they were having to overcome differed from person to person, right? There was no one consistent experience among individuals, right? So, you know, for some people, it was the managing remote schooling for their children that was the biggest stressor. For others, it was the factor of living alone and feeling isolated, having to be at home alone and working all day. And for yet others, we even heard that the increased time at home with their family was actually having a positive impact on their well-being, because they were able to spend more time with their family and other loved ones. So bottom line is, well-being is always going to be an individual experience. And so it's imperative for organizations to be offering a variety of solutions and education and strategies to target those different approaches and opportunities and challenges.
Brilliant. Okay, conscious of the time, I'll get on with some questions. If you would like to make a question, please again use the questions section of the control panel. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. We have a question for Elizabeth. Many thanks for your comments. You mentioned that employers have an obligation to offer reasonable adjustments in certain circumstances. Could you please provide some examples of what these reasonable adjustments might be?
Gosh, well, there are some examples in the guidance, and of course now I can't remember what those are off the top of my head, but just like Krista was saying, they're going to vary not just from employee to employee in terms of what will work for that individual, but also from organisation to organisation, because what is reasonable will depend on the size and resources of the employer in question. And of course, it will now also depend on considerations that arise out of COVID. So it could be something as simple as allowing that person to work shorter hours, more flexible hours, maybe take, I mean, in the past, of course, this was the exception rather than the rule, sometime working from home, time off for counselling appointments. There really is no limit to what might be a reasonable adjustment. I mean, one thing that I think is interesting, and this also links into the right to request flexible working, which is a statutory right, is that in the past, I think, as I say, it has been an exception. You know, there are sometimes some employers, as Chris was saying, have a kind of cultural resistance to this kind of thing. I think now that's blown open really by COVID, and it's going to be much harder for many employers to argue that certain things are not reasonable, not practicable. But I'm sorry, because I feel I should be able to come up with some more specific examples, and being put on the spot, I'm afraid I can't think of any, but I'm sure there are lots. And if you look at the guidance that accompanies the Equality Act, there's plenty set out in there, but obviously they're non-exhaustive.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Chris, we're getting quite a few comments thanking you for being so honest and open with your story. So you definitely touched a few people there. You mentioned a little about cultural issues. Is there anything specific you might want to highlight there in terms of where you've spoken and how your story has resonated or not resonated, or indeed, you know, how generally some organisations don't relate to this sort of thing?
Yeah, look, what I think I'd say is that my experience of speaking to different organisations and in different countries and geographies around the world are that the underlying issues around mental ill health are almost identical. It's sort of uncanny, you know, people struggling with anxiety, stress, not sleeping properly, depression, OCD, you know, the full spectrum of mental health issues. So the underlying issues are all the same, but where organizations are, and particularly culturally in different countries, will have a big impact. So I guess the most obvious one that I can give is in relation to India, where I obviously got a lot of experience and I've spoken to many organizations there. But as many people will know on the call, Indians will often live in an extended family. And so there'll be, you know, the parents, there'll be uncles and aunts, there'll perhaps be grandparents, and the sort of big family unit. And in many respects, that provides an incredibly positive support and an environment that helps individuals. The flip side is that there's a notion that somehow mental ill health is shameful and is something that should not be discussed outside the family, that it's something that will pass, that maybe if you go and visit the local temple and do your puja, that will be the end of it. But the last thing you do is to go and speak to somebody outside the family. The last thing you do is take, quotes, Western medication, about which people have very strong views. and the last thing you do is go and speak to a counsellor. And I've seen too many instances where people have struggled for a long time and got very ill. I actually know of one instance where somebody sadly caught in that circumstance committed suicide. So we just need to be very mindful in different jurisdictions where organisations might be listening into this, that the approach they will need to adopt will need to be very sensitive to the cultural position in that country, certainly until it starts to change.
Next question for Krista and Chris, actually. So, seeing your considered approaches to well-being positively in the firm, how has this affected the attraction and retention of talent? Whether we progress in this area as a result of firms looking for a competitive advantage in the talent war?
You know, Elizabeth touched on this earlier. We know that the talent pool is looking for this type of focus and support in an organization they choose to join. And this is especially true for the generations coming up in the talent force. What's also interesting when it comes to mental health and lawyer populations is that we know through recent research that it's actually the more junior attorneys who tend to struggle the most with things like depression and substance misuse and anxiety. So not only are they really looking for this in an employer, but they also tend to be the ones who need the support from their employer more than others. So it's both attraction and retention strategy when it comes to the talent consideration of this factor. Absolutely.
Accenture have done a great piece of research. I think it was in 2019, if people want to Google it, on workplace mental health, which they did in conjunction with a charity called This Can Happen. And their findings were absolutely clear and completely consistent with what Krista's just said, which is that organizations that are led by individuals that really get the mental health point, that have mental health, or the broader, as Krista quite rightly says, because it's not just mental health, it's about the whole person, has that close to the top of the agenda, will increasingly have a competitive advantage. And whilst I can't sit here today and say that we're attracting X more people than we would otherwise have done because we've adopted a very strong approach towards mental ill health, or that we're retaining more people, but I'm sure that sort of research will be done in due course, and Accenture certainly have suggested that those people who do have open and supportive cultures will be in a much stronger position than those people who don't take this topic really seriously.
There's been some trends about in certain jurisdictions about the right to disconnect for workers. Is that something that any of you see might be continuing as a trend?
I'm happy to jump in there, actually, John, if that's all right. I sometimes worry when one little thing gets picked out and for attention. I mean, it's much more than it's a whole bunch of things, and frankly, if you have a bit of disconnect, then employers will find a way of making sure if they're not the right sort of employer to get what they want. So in other words, you can, before the disconnect happens, you just give somebody a whole bunch of work that they need to do before. So for me, it's much more than that, and I think it's so I have very strong views about these things, and I share this with everyone who's willing to be bored by me. But I have all my notifications turned off always, and I have it on silent always, and I can go through why that is, but it's probably completely obvious. And yet I'm regarded as one of the most responsive lawyers working in India, because at the end of a meeting I'll check, I'll message, I'll WhatsApp somebody saying, seen you've called, I've got a slot at 6 p.m, I can call you back then. And so there are ways of dealing with things, I think, that will get to the heart of it, rather than picking out a single thing that says you have a legal right to disconnect at a particular time. It would be my view.
Elizabeth, what's your...
Well, if I can just jump in, I think Chris is right, and in certain workplaces, and I think you referenced the junior bankers. Maybe we won't mention which bank, but I think in those sorts of workplaces, and particularly where things are high stress, a deal's coming up, whatever, it's not going to make any difference. Having said that, I think with all of these things, they're about nudging behaviour change. You could say the same about any piece of legislation, about equality legislation, that it's about catching the bad employers and giving employees an opportunity to do something if those employers are really are really behaving poorly in whatever regard. So as I understand it, the right to disconnect is not a freestanding right to go to a court or tribunal and say, oh, my employer hasn't respected this, but you can tag it on to another claim. So if you're claiming constructive unfair dismissal or failure to make reasonable adjustments, part of that could be, look, they kept sending me emails at 11 o'clock at night. So I do actually think, and I entirely take on board Chris's point, but I do think these things are helpful, because what they do is they give employees in the poorer behaving workplaces something to something to rely on in the worst case scenario.
Krista, I'm going to give the last question to you, because we're almost out of time, but what would you say is the most important message a leader can communicate about well-being during the pandemic?
That it's okay not to be okay. And in the same breath, to be reminding your employees of what resources are available to them, whether that's through your organization or through another community that can be supportive of them if they feel like they do need professional support for a mental health challenge. So recognizing that it's okay to not be okay, and there are resources to help you if you need them.
That's great. I think that's probably just about all we have time for. Many thanks to Elizabeth, Krista and Chris for taking the time to be with us today. And everyone watching this section, thank you for joining us in this first webinar from IEL. Just a reminder that we have recorded this and we'll be sharing the recording online in the coming days. So you can rewatch if you missed anything. Please feel free to share it. And thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you in the webinar soon. Take care.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, John. Good night.